Okay, today is Monday, January 16th, MLK Day. I'm going to try to finish off Zechariah today, and then we'll read chapters 5 and 6 of Ezra to catch up with the timeline. The last 6 chapters of Zechariah, 9 through 14, are pretty difficult. They are actually, I think, some of the most difficult chapters in the entire Bible. They are split up into 2 visions, 2 oracles, of 3 chapters each, 9 through 11 and 12 through 14. Of course, the chapters, remember, are invented. They weren't part of the text originally. So there's 2 visions, 2 oracles that Zechariah records here. These seem to be occurring at some point later in time after his first batch of prophecies in the first chapters of the book. So Zechariah first received his call to be a prophet to the people while they were building the temple, beginning the process of rebuilding the temple in 520 BC. Haggai actually was the first one to come, and he spurred the people on to working on the temple, and Zechariah came along a couple months later and continued with that message. Then he had a vision, or a series of visions at night, apparently all in the span of one night, and communicated those visions. And those visions basically encouraged the people to continue building the temple. God was going to be with them. He was going to bless them. He was going to empower them. They were going to finish his temple. Zerubbabel was going to finish his temple. Joshua, the high priest, was going to be the high priest of this temple. And if the people were faithful to him, they would be blessed in the land again. They would have peace. They would have prosperity. And the Messiah would come and everything would be great. Then in chapter 7 and 8, we had a conversation where the people from Bethel came to ask the prophets and priests a question, and Zechariah answered. And now, 9 through 14, we have a series of visions, two of them really, 2 oracles that appear to be concerning something different. The section of Zechariah is not dated. It's not explicitly identified as being Zechariah either, but it's included in his book, and there really isn't any reason to believe that he did not write this. I mean, it was included in the words of the prophet Zechariah, and although he does not identify himself by name here, there's not really any reason to assume it isn't him. Although I do think it takes place at a later point in time. His earlier prophecies all fit within the context of the rebuilding the temple project. And that was in 520 to 515 BC. This seems to be occurring at a later point in time. I can't really say how much later in time. Maybe 20 years, maybe 40 years. Zechariah was apparently a young man when he first prophesied, because he's called a young man in the night visions by the angels. The angels referred to him as a young man when they talked to each other about him. And that would have been when they were in 520, when the rebuilding project was just getting underway. And apparently he's still alive even in Nehemiah's day, because he is referenced as one of the leading priests, or leaders of the family of the priests at that time in Nehemiah 12, and that was about 60 years later, and it seems like he's still alive and is one of the leaders of that family at that time. So he would have been a fairly young man when his ministry started, and apparently lived many years thereafter. So these 2 oracles apparently came to him at some later point in time after the temple was rebuilt, and sometime in the rest of his life. I don't know, though. They're not dated. They're not dated. It's very similar to Isaiah, in fact, when Isaiah gave a series of prophecies about things that were going on in his day, because he did. The first 40 chapters of Isaiah, 39 chapters of Isaiah, are about things that were occurring in his own day. And he arranged his material in sections. You had the introductory section, which kind of previewed his entire prophecy in chapters 1 through 5. Then you had him giving the account of his call at the climax of that in chapter 6. Then you had chapters 7 and 8, which were about, actually 7 and 8 were a narrative about his interaction he had with the wicked king of his time, and then he had a series of prophecies about the upcoming king. He used apparently the upcoming birth of his own son, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, as an example of something that would happen in the future, which referring to Emmanuel. That was in chapter 7 and 8, and then talked about this coming king in chapters 9 through, I think, 12. And then 13 to 27 were about the nations around him. Okay, so we had that, and then he finally reaches the point where he gives us a narrative, of a historical account of the invasion of Judah and Jerusalem by the forces of Assyria in the days of Hezekiah. And that ends, and then from chapter 40 and onward, he looks down the road to a time well after his own day, to when the people are in exile in Babylon. You know, at the time Isaiah ends, Babylon is itself subjected to Assyria. But he's looking down the road 100 years later, when Babylon takes over from Assyria and then conquers Judah and Jerusalem. And he's looking on even several decades beyond that, when people come back at the hands of Cyrus, okay, which we've read about now in the rest of the books, you know, as we've continued on. And I think Zechariah did something similar here. After he gets done dealing with the issues of his own day, he has these two visions that look down the road to things that are to come, well after his day. Both of these visions, both of these oracles, have to do with the coming king, the coming Messiah. This first section, 9 through 11, seems to be one of those parts of the Bible. Actually, both of these sections, both these oracles are like this, and that they seem to be referring to multiple things at once. Okay, so in this first oracle, 9 through 11, he's going to be talking about the upcoming Grecian invasion of this area of the world, and which Daniel has already prophesied in his own ministry in decades past. Daniel received a vision of the coming kingdoms and kings, and one of those kingdoms was the Grecian kingdom, represented primarily, or at least initially, by the prominent horn of Alexander the Great, and then the four horns that take his place after he gets broken off unexpectedly, early. And so that's going to happen. That did happen in history. And Zechariah now seems to be talking about that too here in this first oracle. And he's going to contrast that with the Jews' king to come, which is Jesus. Now, some of these verses are quoted in the New Testament, so we know what their ultimate meaning is. That helps us interpret what some of these verses mean. Not the whole passage, unfortunately. Some of it we're kind of left to speculate on. But remember how in Isaiah, during his section in the later part of the book, where he looked down the road hundreds of years into the future and saw these things all before they happened? Zechariah is going to be doing the same thing here too. And just like Isaiah saw Cyrus coming along and typified him as a type of servant, you know, Cyrus, in the second half of Isaiah starts kind of talking about a servant a lot. And there's a lot of different meanings of that, okay? There's a lot of different kinds of servants who he talks about at different points. You had Israel, the nation of Israel as a servant. You have the man, Israel himself, Jacob, Israel as a servant. Then you have Cyrus as a servant. Of course, all of these are different types of servants leading up to the real servant, which is the Messiah. Then you have all these other servants are flawed in some way or another. You know, Israel ultimately did not keep his covenant with God. Jacob himself was a sinner. Cyrus did what God commanded him to do, but even though he didn't know God and wasn't doing it for God's sake. So we have these different kinds of servants who God uses all in some capacity or another. Sometimes wittingly, sometimes not, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. And then you have the perfect servant to come, the suffering servant, the messianic servant. And we're going to have that here too also in Zechariah 9 through 11. We're going to be contrasting Alexander the Great with Jesus as two different kinds of kings that are going to be coming into Jerusalem for vastly different reasons and vastly different purposes. So this section here in Zechariah 9 through 11 is going to be confusing if you don't know the history that's pointing to, because it's using the actual historical march of Alexander the Great through the Promised Land on his worldwide conquest as a backdrop to talk about the coming King, Jesus, which the New Testament will quote part of this and apply to Jesus' own day. And that's 9 through 11, and then 12 through 14 gets even more confusing, because instead of referring to actual historical events that occurred in history, it really does refer to things that are very hard to pin down, like, you know, what it actually is applying to. So we'll take this in chunks. We'll do 9 to 11 and 12 through 14. And we'll go ahead and start a new video now to get to 9 to 11.